You're listening to When Life Gives You Lemons, the podcast that speaks to high-performing individuals who have been through adversity but come back stronger. I'm your host, Emma Levy, a physiotherapist who has helped elite athletes on their way to Olympic success. This podcast was born following my own trauma, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of just 36. Sat in the chemo chair, I set myself the goal of starting a podcast to explore resilience and the importance of mindset. Today I'm welcoming Lauren Murrell to the podcast. Lauren is the co-founder of the skincare brand BySarah, which has a remarkable story of inception. When Lauren was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia at age 23, her sister Sarah became her stem cell donor and saved Lauren's life. Following a grueling period of cancer treatment and recovery, Lauren was finally able to return home from hospital and attempt to return to normal living. Throughout her recovery, Lauren struggled with her skin, and so her big sister Sarah stepped in again, developing her own skincare formulas for her. It was through this process of finding natural, soothing, and restorative products for sensitive skin that BySarah was born. Lauren left her career in law to start up the skincare business with her sister. Today, the brand is much loved by many, is award-winning, has been featured in Vogue, On This Morning, and much more. Lauren, that's quite the story.
Thank you for such a warm introduction. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for chatting to us today. It is quite a story, but do you want to tell the story in your own words and what happened when you were 23?
Yeah, so I will take us back to February 2012. And I was at law school at the time, just cracking on with my studies and my career, when I was taken to A&E and hospitalized overnight and told I had leukemia. I was 23, as you say, at the time, very fit, very healthy, and it was a complete shock, very unexpected. And I then went into months of very, very intensive treatment, starting with chemotherapy, which didn't work, then total body irradiation, and then eventually that life-saving stem cell transplant from Sarah. So it was, as I say, such a shock because I was so young and fit and just didn't see that coming. But it was a journey that Sarah and I very much went on together as sisters.
What was your symptoms when it all started? How did you know you were so unwell?
It sort of built up over a few weeks, and it sort of got to a crescendo where I had really severe pains in my neck. I had night sweats, lethargy, completely out of sorts, very, very unwell. And we had to call an ambulance to the home because my condition was just getting worse and worse and worse. And we just didn't know what was happening. So when I was taken to A&E, they thought maybe it's scarlet fever, glandular fever. And they were sort of bounding around all these terms, and it sounded really scary, but they weren't actually saying cancer at that moment. It was when they took the blood test, and obviously I was off the charts. And that's when they hospitalized me and thought, okay, we've got to get cracking here.
Yeah, it's serious now.
Yeah.
And you said the chemo didn't work. Is that quite unusual for that type of leukemia, for chemo not to work?
Well, the whole diagnosis for me was very unusual in that leukemia is typically an older person's cancer. So I was 23 and fit and healthy. So that diagnosis was very odd, very rare, very, very rare. And it's a really difficult cancer to treat. So I actually only had a 20% chance of survival, which was a heck of a deal to be shared. And so what that meant was very early on, we had to see if I would have the chance of a stem cell match, because if the chemo didn't work, I'd need a plan B. But even then, it's really difficult to, within a family, get a perfect match. So I think the odds for Sarah being a perfect match or a sibling is 25%.
Wow.
So again, really miraculous that Sarah was a perfect match. If you don't have a match within your family, what people have to do is apply for someone else to be their donor. And there's registers that you can apply to, but it's really difficult. It's really, really challenging. And the odds are really not in your favor if you've got that diagnosis.
And it's a really grueling treatment, isn't it, for AML?
Yeah.
And I believe you were quite isolated and you weren't allowed to see anyone when you were an inpatient.
Yeah.
And this was obviously, 12 years ago, so long before COVID times. But when COVID came round, Well, that was actually when I was going through my cancer treatment. So I can empathize because, with COVID, you weren't allowed any visitors, anyone with you at any point, which, I found very difficult.
Yeah.
And it's actually when I turned to podcasts was during that process. And I wanted to ask you, what about you? Did you learn anything from that period of isolation?
I think I had to, because leukemia is such a brutal cancer because it's the blood, which means it's the whole body. So the collateral damage from leukemia treatment is really, really, really tough to go through. Layer on top the fact that you have to be kept in protective isolation because the cancer treatment means you've essentially got no immune system. So I could only have my immediate family, which was Sarah, my mum and my dad, visit, because anyone else coming in, the risk that they would bring just a common cold could send me to intensive care. So it was really serious. And of course, my family, they had to wear protective masks and aprons and gloves, and they couldn't touch me. So even when I had people near me, they were still distant. So really intensive isolation and not being able to leave the hospital room, let alone the hospital, for weeks and months on end is really challenging. But I learned to quickly come to terms with that and to essentially curate my hospital room so that it became a place that was hopeful for the future because I hoped that life would be much brighter than those bare white walls around me. So I started to do things like posters on my wall, and I would journal, and I actually brought a Nordic cross trainer into my hospital room, and just for the early days while I could still, move around, just try and bring life into that space, because I couldn't find it anywhere else. I had to sort of bring it to me, as it were.
Yeah, and you talk about hope. So when I was going through my cancer treatment, I had a friend going through treatment for AML, and we were both isolated. So we used to text from our chemo wards, and I know kind of how difficult the treatment you went through is. And you said you always had hope, but did you ever feel like you wanted to give up?
No, not at all. In those really early days, I remember thinking, which is quite a strange thought to have, but this is happening for a reason. And I couldn't bear it when the nurses, when they knew the diagnosis, they would look at me with such sorrow and almost pity. I'm like, no, I'll be fine. Like, don't worry, I'll be fine. And of course, they knew what was coming for me in the weeks and months that followed, which I couldn't possibly comprehend at that time. But there was no chance in my mind that I'd lose hope. Of course, there were days that I cried and I was so upset, but I always believed that I'd get through it. I don't know why, but I just did.
Yeah, and hope is so important. And it reminds me actually of, I don't know if you've heard, one of my podcast guests, Ricky Nuttall, told me about an experiment on hope done by a psychologist. Do you know this experiment with the rats?
I don't, no.
I found this really interesting. So there was a psychologist who put a rat in a bucket of water and waited to see how long it could swim for before it drowned. And at about 15 minutes, it was about to drown. So the psychologist took the rat out, fed it, let it recover. And then when the rat was recovered, he put the rat back in the bucket of water. And this time, the rat was able to keep swimming, not for 15 minutes like the first time, but for 60 hours.
Oh my word.
Yeah. And the psychologist explained this, that he thought it was because of hope. Because the first time he was rescued, the second time he was hopeful that he was going to be rescued again. So he kept going.
Oh, I love that. Yes,
yeah, I really think about that story a lot now. And yeah, I think being in that chemo ward, hope is an important thing. But I do wonder where you had that mindset from. And you were only young, you were 23. Do you think it was anything to do with your upbringing, or do you think you just innately had it in you?
It's probably a bit of nature and nurture, isn't it? It's really hard to look back and know where that came from. But I think I've always been a very focused, driven, ambitious person. So I think on some level, I almost approached it like a project. I'd always been, before, a high achiever. If there was an exam, I would study, I would get good grades. I was at law school, so very trained to approach a task, study for it, sit the exam, and sort of move on. So I guess on some level, I approached it in that way of, okay, this is the project, this is the task ahead. What am I going to do to put myself in as best a position as possible to get through it? I don't think I actually spoke in those words to myself, but there must have been an element of that in the approach that I applied to get through the day to day. And of course, my sister and my mum and dad were hugely supportive and instrumental in almost creating that strategy with me, because we knew it was going to be a really long slog. And even once I left hospital, I had to be very aware of bugs in the environment. So, I still had to be isolating once I was back home. I had to be on a very strict diet. And it just went on and on and on for years, really, even after hospital, to recover and fully regain that strength in all senses of the word.
Yeah. So how did Sarah actually come about giving you that stem cell transplant? Did she volunteer for it, or how did that actually come about? Because I can imagine that can come with some really big psychological challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine what that was like for Sarah, to know that essentially my life was in her hands at this point. So there was some tests that they did for her to see if she was a match. And then when we knew that the chemo wasn't working, we then had Sarah as plan B. So the actual procedure for Sarah was pretty intrusive. I think it was about 5 or 6 hours, where they essentially extract the stem cells from Sarah's blood. And then the same day, that was given to me as the transplant through IV. So what I actually really love about that day, we call it my second birthday, which is the 9th of August. And on that day, my blood type changed to be the same as Sarah's through that process. So we're very close in age, just less than 2 years apart, and growing up very close as sisters. And now that day is not just my second birthday, but the day that, we became even more closely intertwined. So a very special moment.
Does she ever joke and say like, hey, you owe me one?
She could say that forever, and I could never really repay her for that. But yeah, she can definitely use that one.
Yeah. So you came out of hospital and, it's a long recovery, but you went back to law school, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah.
And was that always the plan, or did you kind of feel at that point changed by your cancer? Like at that point, did you have different ambitions, or were you just kind of straight back on the path that you'd been on before your diagnosis?
I was absolutely determined to get back on track, as it were. I was so upset when my diagnosis came that my job would be taken away from me, because I was at law school. I had my job lined up. I'd worked so hard for years to make that a possibility for myself. So that was so upsetting for me at the time. But thankfully, I had the most graceful and supportive employer that supported me through this journey. So 2 years later, I did take that job, and I started my career in the city. Obviously finishing at law school first. So completely different person by then. I had donated my hair when I knew I was going to lose it to charity. So my hair looked different. I was still very fatigued at this point. So I had to really pace myself, and still, I wasn't going to bars and clubs with my peers because I just didn't have that energy. It took a really long time to come back, but I was just very focused on, I knew that path would get me to the next step. So it was finish law school, start my career, and in my own mind to sort of, get back on track.
Yeah. And then you went traveling, am I right? You traveled with work.
Yeah.
And was that something you'd always wanted to do? Or do you think that was, from a newfound perspective on life?
I think there's a couple of things I did. Speaking about curating my hospital room, I put 2 posters on my wall that I would look at every day. And for me, became so much more than just sort of the wallpaper, if you like. They were really beacons of hope for me and very meaningful for me. One was a poster of New York, and the other was of the Caribbean. And I studied geography actually at university. So very curious about the world, a strong sense of wanderlust. And so when I started my career, I had the opportunity to work in the New York office. So I really did manifest that poster and jumped into that experience. And it was, a real dream come true to have that experience.
And then you went to the Caribbean?
I did, yes. So then I came back from there. I came back to London and thought, where can I go next? And, have a bit of an adventure. That's when I moved to the Caribbean, that second poster, which was, a real treat, a real delight, until, brace yourself, a hurricane hit the island. And I was there at the time. And, a really terrifying moment to live through. 5 days, I had no contact with friends and family, so they didn't know if I was dead or alive. Really horrific experience to go through. But eventually I was rescued and evacuated off the island and came back to the UK. And Sarah, again, was really instrumental in organising that rescue. So, yes, It's been a wild few years, to say the least.
But at that point, when you're stuck in a hurricane, in the Caribbean, and you've just recently recovered from leukemia, are you at that point saying, give me a break, why me? Or were you still cracking on with your positive mindset?
I think in that moment it was just pure survival. Like, the house I was in was shaking. I genuinely didn't know if it was going to slide down the hill and I'd be part of the rubble. So it was a very strong moment. I was with a couple of people in the house at the time, and there was a lot of bonding, shall we say, in those moments where you go through something like that. You're a changed person in some ways, because you've gone through something so extreme with people that have gone through that with you. So you make some really strong bonds. But yes, always very optimistic for the future, no matter what happens. My story just seems to be quite extreme in the things that I experience. But always positive and hopeful that there's a way through.
So then you came home from the Caribbean, and I believe it was around then that the business BySarah started to come about.
That's right.
So tell us about the inception of that.
So in the years prior, while I was pushing on with my career, I was still really struggling with my skin. And it's something I really have to be mindful of even to this day. And because the treatment for AML is so brutal, there's really not an ounce of your body that isn't impacted in some way. And for me, because the skin is the largest organ, the skin takes an absolute battering. It would just shed and be so sensitive and dry and rashy and red, top to toe, and just break out. And so Sarah, seeing my skin in that way, thought how she could help me. And Sarah worked in the industry at the time, and she'd spent years at Estée Lauder, L'Oreal, Unilever, and she was aware of the ingredients that could really help to soothe my skin barrier, because that's what was really struggling. So she literally made skincare at the kitchen table. And after a long day in the office and on weekends, she would come to the hospital and share these with me. And, I'd rub them into my skin and think, how lucky am I that I've got a really wonderful sister that could share these formulations with me. But there was no sense of a business in those days. It was just very much Sarah trying to support me. And over the years, Sarah traveled extensively, researched even further, and really refined her formulations. So by the time I came back, Sarah was so ready to share her formulations even more widely beyond friends and family at this moment in time. And we thought maybe there's more people like me, not so extreme in their skin conditions, but people that are really struggling with sensitive skin. They don't know who to turn to. The options are quite limited. Maybe we can help more people. So we started very organically and would just do events and pop-ups and workshops, and just eventually and slowly and gradually that word of mouth spread. And over the years, we've developed and grown the business to the point where we're really well recognized now as the brand for people with sensitive skin. We've got clinically proven products in our collection. The whole collection is approved by dermatologists. But more than that, for me personally, we've got the most incredible community at BySarah of people who love the brand, who love the skincare, and have seen the transformation in their own skin. So whether they're going through change like pregnancy, perimenopause, menopause, or even post-COVID, or some kind of illness that triggers something in their skin, they see the transformation in using our skincare. And for me, that's just absolutely incredible, because in the beginning it was BySarah for Lauren, and now it's BySarah for so many more people. So it's a real joy.
And how do you find life as an entrepreneur versus a lawyer?
Well, I think I was blessed to have that career. It taught me so many valuable lessons, and I worked with some really smart people that really inspired me. I think as an entrepreneur now, it's different, but the same in some respects, in that, it's very challenging, the hours are long, but the difference now is it's off our own bat. Where Sarah and I are our own bosses, and we get to drive the agenda and make the impact that we hope to achieve. So I'm glad that I had that experience. It's really served me well, but it's a real joy to be able to do what we're doing today, and see that result in the work that you do, the people that we serve, the impact that we're making. It's really fulfilling.
Am I right in saying it's 12 years on from your cancer now? Is it 12 years?
Yes, big milestone.
Yeah. So how do you find it now talking about your cancer 12 years on? Because you're a bit ahead of the game compared to me.
It's taken a really long time, years and years and years. So when I first started work, the last thing I wanted to talk about was, yes, I've just had cancer. That was just not really part of my conversation. A big turning point for me was COVID, actually. And being in that lockdown environment, many of my friends were really struggling with that. And they said to me, Lauren, you've already been through this. What did you do? How can you help me? And I realized actually sharing the ways that I got through that protective isolation period could help others. So I actually shared my story for the very first time on Deliciously Ella's podcast during COVID. And that was a really vulnerable moment for me. I hadn't really opened up so much about that episode because it's just so hard. And if you go too deep, it's like, oof, it can be quite raw. But in some ways, the more podcasts I've done, the easier it gets, because that burden becomes a bit lighter. And then people often reach out, or they say, I heard you there, that really helped me in this moment. And then you realize that trauma, to use your word from earlier, actually becomes a gift to help others if you are willing and courageous enough to share it. And you don't have to keep it to yourself forever.
Yeah, I always describe this podcast like my therapy.
Yes, I see that. Yeah, very much.
Because like you're saying, it makes it easier and easier to talk about. So when you start, it was very difficult to talk about it. But now, having had multiple conversations, and then hearing other people's perspectives, I find it just very helpful. Since you started talking about it relatively recently, only like 4 years ago, have you noticed any changes in yourself having started to talk about your story?
Just that it becomes lighter. It doesn't have to be such a big moment. I mean, it was so extreme and lasted for so long, but it doesn't define me. That's just a chapter, as it were. There's so many other chapters before that, after that, and those that I'll live as well. So it just becomes part of you, but it doesn't define you.
Yeah, this is so funny you say it, because I was literally just about to say, do you ever feel like you don't want to be defined by it? Because the problem I imagine with you is that you've kind of started a brand and a product off the back of your cancer. So you do go out there and you do talk about it because, the story of where you were to where you are now. So how do you deal with that and not wanting to be defined by it?
I think it's when you allow others to share their stories. So in sharing your story first, it allows others to share theirs. And then you create a community and it moves away from just you. But you've got to start first to, in a way, create that safe space for others. And as I say, that's the real gift. Because if you don't share it first, then there's not that opportunity for others to share and have those moments of connection. So it's just being courageous enough just to take that first step and say, this is the story, this is what happened. And now you kind of set it live and into the world, and others can take it and hopefully share their stories as a result.
And talking about it though, it brings it back into the consciousness, doesn't it? So do you ever get any anxiety recurrence of your cancer?
No, I think I really lived it, if that makes sense, in that I was very aware of how serious things were for me, how unwell I was, and I was very accepting of it in the sense that I knew I was very unwell and I would have to do many things that were very difficult. So I was processing what was happening at the time, rather than being in a state of sort of semi-denial that it wasn't really happening and that potentially could catch up with me later. So I really did deal with it in the moment. So I actually had my annual checkup just a couple of weeks ago, but it's my least favorite day of the year for sure, but it's not a big triggering moment for me. I just deal with it, approach it. I actually share it. I guess that's part of the process as well. And then, on to the day and carry on again. Don't sort of let it overtake me, overwhelm me.
I've actually got written down here the post that you wrote on your LinkedIn after you had your annual checkup, because I thought it was brilliant. I'm going to read it. It says, this journey has so you wrote this basically. Yeah. This journey has transformed me. I'm stronger than I ever thought possible, more resilient in the face of challenges, deeply grateful for each day. I've come to see my annual checkup as much more than just my health. It's just a reminder of how far I've come, from patient to entrepreneur, from surviving to thriving. And I think you just summarized it so beautifully, because we often talk about resilience on this podcast. And how the traumatic incidents that we've been through make us stronger, more resilient people. And I from reading that, I think you probably agree that what you went through has made you a stronger, more resilient person. Is that correct?
Oh, I think so. I think, you go through something like that. And for me, I think it makes you more of who you already are. So for me, I was very driven and focused and determined, and I'm even more so now. That's how I got through those moments. And not to say it was easy, not to say that was a fast moment, but I think the more time that passes, you can look back and think, wow, gosh, I've come so far. I'm so lucky to be here still. I have so many wonderful people in my life. There's so much to be grateful for. So I try and keep that feeling close all the time.
I think you should write a self-help book.
I would love to one day. Absolutely. That's on the list. Yeah.
Because I think it sounds to me like the way you approached it, everything you said, just like dealing with it, processing it at the time, and, the positive mindset you had, people just need to follow your formula.
Yeah, I wish I'd codified it more at the time. It's something I need to do for sure. I would love to write a book. I think there's so many things I look back and I think, it's almost like I had a blueprint, but I don't quite know where that all came from. But somehow, it landed in my head and I made it happen, and, it really served me well.
Yeah, because other strategies that you used as well, that, you briefly talked about having a cross trainer in your hospital room. Yeah. You were way ahead of the curve there, because now in chemo wards, they have exercise bikes.
Well, do they? Love that. Yeah. Love to hear that.
Not all of them, but there definitely is a trend going towards the fact that they're finding benefits, I think, of people exercising during chemo treatment. Yeah. So when I read an article you wrote, I think it was maybe an article in Vogue, and you said that you had a cross trainer. I was like, oh my goodness, she was like 12 years ahead of it.
Yeah, I remember one of the doctors came in the room, and I think because the drugs were so strong and they obviously cross brain blood barrier, chemo brain, like not quite with it all the time. I remember working out like 5:30 in the morning, and a doctor coming in and him saying, In my 25 years of practice, I have never seen this before. I'm like, it's all good here, just going. So those were in the very, very early weeks. I was a very keen runner at the time. So that was my way to kind of keep that part of my identity going for as long as I could. You know, I was losing my hair, so that was going. I was no longer a law student, so that identity was going. Fitness, just about keep that part of my identity going. So exercise is so, so powerful.
Yeah, I often talk about the benefits of exercise for me. I mean, it was like the one thing you could kind of still control. But I also had a funny incident when I went for a run the day of my treatment, and basically I'd had an injection in my leg. So about 10 minutes down the road, I just couldn't weight bear. As in, I was in agony in my leg. And I remember phoning up the chemo ward and they were like, why did you go for a run? And I was like, well, you didn't tell me I couldn't. You know? So but you know, it was that kind of control and also the positive feeling, the endorphins that exercise gives you. Yeah, I'm a big pro. I could just keep talking about that for hours. Other strategies, are there any other strategies that you would recommend that you use that kind of have helped you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so many. One that I would share is the power of mindset. In moments like that, particularly for me, where I couldn't escape my thoughts or that room, it was making my mind my best friend. And so I remember really early on, and I had really long blonde hair at the time, and that was starting to fall out. And that's quite distressing to see your hair all over the floor of the hospital room. But I remember standing at the bathroom mirror and saying, keep strong, keep really strong. And that was a mindset and a sort of a mantra that I would keep coming back to. Another aspect for me, I was actually extremely phobic of needles. So when I was in A&E having that blood test, I was on the verge of passing out. It was like horrendous for me. Within probably 48 hours, I had what's called a Hickman line. You probably know Hickman line. They insert tubing into your chest cavity so that they can use that to insert the chemo drugs, not using your arm, which would become a bit of a pin cushion. So I went from, in a few days, being phobic of needles to having this tubing hanging out of my neck and this long blonde hair all falling out. So I think the intensity and speed at which it all happened, it sort of accelerated my process of accepting what was happening, because it was so rapid that my mind had to sort of keep up with the change. So that affirmation was extremely helpful and grounding for me. And also one I found a little bit later in a book by Arianna Huffington, which I recommend to everyone, called Thrive. And it was a quote from Rumi, which is, live life as if everything is rigged in your favor. And I remember reading that in the book. It wasn't set out as a quote. It was just a few words as part of the paragraph. I was like, oh, wow, light bulb moment. It just absolutely struck me. And I thought, that's it. That's my North Star. That's exactly how I see the world. So yes, there have been so many curveballs, so many setbacks, so many chapters I could never have seen coming. But I've always found my mind to be my greatest ally in navigating these moments, because I think you go one of two ways. You can feel very, very helpless and victimized. But in that place, you lose all agency to do anything about it. So I find that mantra particularly helpful in letting you know there's something you can do about it.
Yeah. And I think I love that. Make your mind your best friend.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that one. I've not heard it said like that before, and I really, really like it. I'm going to ask you one final question. If you could go back in time to when things were at their toughest, what do you wish you could tell yourself?
Well, actually, there's a funny story that comes to mind, which is probably not the answer to your question, but I'll share it anyway. In one of my really difficult moments, I was, really weak at this point on a morphine drip 24/7. But I remember And this is the weird thing with chemo, in that it does pass the blood-brain barrier. So you do have sort of weird things that you speak about. I remember my family just teasing me with weird things that I would say. I wish they'd recorded it now. It'd be quite funny. But at the time, it was just strange. But I remember late at night, I had buzzed for one of the nurses to see if they could come in the room to help me, because I know my mum, desperately trying to feed me, would bring me all kinds of foods, because I really couldn't swallow or eat at all. It was really, really difficult. So just anything that was sort of sweet or easy to eat, she'd bring, and I'd try my best to keep it down. But I remember Mum had bought a tin of pineapple, like pineapple chunks. I think I remember buzzing the nurse at like 2 a.m. saying, I'd really like to try these pineapple chunks. And we didn't have a can opener. There was no can opener on the ward. And it was just this whole like completely ridiculous, almost Monty Python, sketch of like this cancer patient wanting this pineapple at 2 a.m. in the morning, and no one had a can opener. It's just like completely insane. So I think to myself in those moments is, hold it lightly, you'll get through it. In moments that feel really difficult and really tense, there's always those little moments of humor that you can find. And I had, really wonderful nurses that were so kind and generous and always trying to help, and as well trying to find the lightness in those difficult moments as well. So yes, we never did open that tin of pineapple chunks. Don't know where that ended up.
Thank you. I love the fact that your final story is something positive. Even that just shows your positivity, your positive mindset. I see lots of parallels between you and me in the way we think, which has been really nice to chat today. But yes, mindset is best friend. I'm going to take that forward. And also the positive affirmations. I can't agree more. I'm always doing positive affirmations in my head. And I think that they do really help. And if I could advise anyone else going through difficult times to take that on board.
What's your favorite affirmation?
I say sometimes it's just really simple. Like, I can. Yeah. Like just really simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it doesn't have to be, complex.
Yeah.
I've been doing lots of these sporting challenges this year. And when things are really tricky in the sporting challenges, in my head, it's like, I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. I can do it.
I heard one that's similar to that, which is, I've written this down in one of my books, is I can, I will.
Yes.
I really like that as well. Like, yeah. Powerful.
Yeah. So I sometimes go, I can, I will, I do.
Oh yes, the I do bit. That's good.
Yeah, like it depends how much time. You know what I mean? If I'm I can, or I can, I will, I do. It's a bit slower, a bit more reflective. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been really, really great to chat.
Pleasure.
I urge everyone to check you out on your website. I'll put your website BySarah as well on the show notes, and then we can all try the products. So thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
I really hope you enjoyed that chat with Lauren. As you can tell, I'm sure I really did enjoy it. And please check back in next week for another amazing guest who's coming on to When Life Gives You Lemons.